And I would like to now give space for Tracy Lai, one of our Seattle chapter leaders, to introduce our next panelist who will talk about the AAPI and labor history of Seattle.
Hi, is that working? Okay, thank you. Well, welcome back, everybody. We have the mini panel, emphasis on mini, because whatever happens, we're going to get to those shuttles so we can get to Embassy Suites. So our job is to give you some history and context so you feel really motivated, because this is a really important action that we are going to be undertaking. So I've already introduced myself a couple of times, and thank you, Michaela, Tracy Lai, AFT. The context for this panel, we wanted people, since the convention is right here in Seattle, we wanted to draw you into that longer history of Asian and Pacific Islanders here in the Pacific Northwest. And so there's just 2 points I want to make before I start, before I introduce my panelists and pose a few questions to them. One of the themes has to do with, well, sounds negative, but it's true, the hate, the violence, and then the other point has more to do with resilience, resistance, and organizing. So here's the historian part of me. 1885-86, the Chinese expulsions from Tacoma and Seattle. 1907, the Bellingham expulsions of the sick timber workers. 1927, expulsion of Filipino workers from Toppenish in eastern Washington. March 30th, 1942, the expulsion of Japanese on Bainbridge Island. So those are just some of the years for us to be reminded of the patterns of exclusion and expulsion. And surrounding all of that, those are the actions, but there's laws, there's policies, there's attitudes, there's a whole culture that normalizes that hate and that you don't belong here and that you'll never really fit in. On the other hand, we have always been about fitting in. We have always been about building our own communities and resisting these kinds of patterns of violence and hate. And we're very proud to be able to point to the lives and the work of the Alaskan cannery workers, because their struggle to survive and to focus attention on how Filipino, Chinese, and Native American workers in the canneries were being treated are still worthy of our attention today because of the ways in which it frames the development of our modern ideas on civil and labor rights. So with that, I would like to introduce our panelists. I'm going to give you the short version because you have lots of information in that multi-paged program booklet. So to my immediate left is Moon-Ho Jung. He's a professor of history, director, and endowed chair of the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies at the University of Washington. Next to Moon is Kent Wong, who has been introduced a number of times. And then to Kent's left, well, it's on your right, Rich Gertiza, first national treasurer of APALA and founder of Seattle APALA chapter, recently retired as regional director of the Alaska Cannery Workers Union, ILWU, IBU, Region 37. And then we have Eunice Howe, who also has been introduced multiple times. So I'm going to just get started because time is running away from us. My first question is for Moon. Your book, Menace to Empire, Anti-Colonial Solidarities and the Trans-Pacific Origins of the U.S. Security State, explores the intersections of anti-colonial movements and the U.S. security state. How do these historical trans-Pacific connections inform our understanding of the challenges and opportunities faced by AAPI workers in their labor struggles, both historically and in the present day.
All right, thank you, Tracy. Can you hear me okay? All right, let me begin with two quotes that capture what my recent book is about. The first is the second epigraph in the introduction. It's a quote from Alex Hing, who was reflecting on the Asian American movement in 1970. This is what Alex Hing wrote. We are Asians and as such identify ourselves with the baddest motherfuckers alive. I'm quoting, okay. We can no longer be a witness to the daily slaughter of our people in Asia, nor to the oppression of Asians here in America, and be afraid of death or prison. We must fight because that's what Asians are all about. Now, the second quote is from the conclusion. These are two sentences that I was really proud of when I wrote them. So yes, I am quoting myself. These are the words of that brilliant historian, Moon Ho Jung. To point out the obvious, a democracy rooted in empire and white supremacy is not democracy. No, you gotta, this is a punchline. That's American democracy. Now, to respond to Trace's prompt, I don't really have practical prescriptions on how my scholarship can help inform today's labor struggle. But I would like to suggest today that the recognition of what the United States is and what it has always been has to be an essential starting point of everything that we do. That is, if we recognize the United States not as a multicultural nation that has welcomed and embraced diversity, the nation of immigrants, the melting pot, and all that crap, but as an empire rooted in white supremacy from its founding to today, we can then begin to see how anti-Asian racism is not an aberration or an exception in US history. Indeed, as most of us know, anti-Asian racism has been a critical element in the making of the United States as a nation and as an empire. To reckon with that history, we have to first recognize and frame that history as such. And second, recognizing that history suggests that the liberal hope of being accepted as full-fledged American is beyond an impossibility for Asian Americans. To me, that is a misguided hope that ultimately feeds the racial and colonial order called the United States of America. So let me try to explain what I mean very quickly. To point out the obvious again, empire and democracy cannot coexist. If the United States is anything, it was and is an empire. It's an empire that has claimed unilateral authority over different lands and peoples, and in recent decades has claimed the authority to incarcerate and kill anybody living in our planet, all in the name of freedom and democracy, of course. As long as the US empire exists, American democracy will remain a violent lie. That is why anyone daring to confront and challenge white supremacy and the US empire has been marked historically as disloyal, un-American, anti-American, communist, and so forth, including Asian American workers active in the labor movement. They needed to be silenced and criminalized to keep up that lie. And that is why Carlos Bulosan, buried right here in Seattle, was targeted by the FBI for possible deportation in the 1950s. Now, the idea that Asians, and especially radical Asian activists, were threats to US national security has deep, very deep historical origins. We can go back at least to the era of Chinese exclusion. To justify the exclusion of Chinese workers, the US Supreme Court ruled in 1889, quote, to preserve its independence and give security against foreign aggression and encroachment is the highest duty of every nation, whether from the foreign nation acting in its national character or from vast hordes of its people crowding in upon us. The government, possessing the powers which are to be exercised for protection and security, is clothed with authority to determine the occasion on which the powers shall be called forth. The court continued, if the U.S. government categorized foreigners of a different race as dangerous to its peace and security, its designation and exclusion could not be stayed because at the time there are no actual hostilities with the nation of which the foreigners are subjects. That was national security in a nutshell. If the U.S. government deemed you a threat, then you were a threat. And race-marked Chinese and other Asian workers as threats to U.S. national security. Over the last few years, anti-Asian racism has become much more visible, but we all know that it's not something new. As we attempt to understand and to confront anti-Asian racism today, in part through the labor movement, I think we need to remember our history and to interpret it radically. It will be tempting to claim our so-called Americanness. At the same time, no matter what we say or what we might not say, we know that we will be attacked for being un-American or anti-American. We can't be misled by those labels. We can exploit those labels, use them ironically if we have to, but we can't be led to believe that American democracy is real democracy in the past or in the present. We should be against empire, including the U.S. empire, and against anti-Asian racism at the heart of that empire. By saying that, that does not mean don't vote or don't organize to vote. If you can vote, vote, okay? But in my view, we should always be striving to work towards something bigger, toward justice and democracy, and that demands a radical understanding of the United States and its violent history of colonialism and racism. And that is why in our struggle for democracy and justice, we should strive to identify with the baddest motherfuckers alive. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Moon. Alex Hing would be so happy that you chose that particular quote. And I'm also really grateful for your persuasive argument on the kind of radical understanding we should strive to undertake. So Kent, throughout your career, you have been at the forefront of advocating for immigrant rights and addressing the challenges faced by undocumented youth. How do you see the intersections between immigrant justice and labor rights, and what strategies do you employ to bridge these causes to create a more cohesive and inclusive movement for social change?
This year celebrates the 31st anniversary of the founding of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, the first organization within the AFL-CIO of Asian American workers. The founding president of the American Federation of Labor, Samuel Gompers, was a lifelong opponent of Asian immigration to the United States. He fought for the enforcement of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and furthermore, he denied admission of any Asian workers into the American Federation of Labor. His rationale was that Asians are unassimilable, cannot be part of the U.S. society, cannot be part of the U.S. labor movement. So when we established APALA back in 1992, it was in direct rejection of the racist legacy of the American Federation of Labor and their founding president, Samuel Gompers. I am so proud to announce that when we held a national APALA racial justice hearing at the AFL-CIO last summer, the very first woman president of the AFL-CIO, Liz Schuler, came to speak at our event, and she stood before hundreds of APALA leaders and activists from around the country as we gathered in the Samuel Gompers room and said, the American Federation of Labor Congress of Industrial Organizations has decided to take down the name of Samuel Gompers from the Samuel Gompers room in the AFL-CIO headquarters. This took 30 years, but it's a reflection of the impact that APALA has had. APALA opposed the racist anti-immigrant policies of the AFL-CIO that had enacted employer sanctions back in 1986. That was based on the advocacy of the AFL-CIO that said, we don't want any more immigrants, we don't want them to join our unions, and we want to send as many as we can back home. These were the same union leaders who were calling immigration authorities on day laborers. So this is a legacy that we need to understand, we need to address, and we need to move forward, because the future of the U.S. labor movement is based on our ability to mobilize and organize immigrant workers. 70% of Asian and Pacific Islander workers are immigrants, 70%. And if we successfully can organize immigrants from Latin America, from the Caribbean, from the Asia-Pacific region, we will build a unified, powerful, strong, united, multiracial labor movement and forge a multiracial democracy which this country has never known. This country has been based on the enslavement of African Americans, has been based on the incarceration of Japanese Americans, have based on the displacement and genocide of Native Americans, and we have a racist Republican Party that is fighting tooth and nail to hide the true history of the United States and to erase people of color, not only from our history, but from the right to vote. So if we allow the racist U.S. Supreme Court to strip communities of color the right to vote, we lose. If we mobilize communities of color in the critical 2024 election year, if we build multiracial unity against white supremacy and corporate domination, we win. So we need to encourage the U.S. labor movement to step up, to lead the fight for multiracial democracy, to lead the fight against white supremacy and racism, to lead the fight for abortion rights against male supremacy, to lead the fight for LGBT workers against the horrendous attacks on LGBT and especially our trans community. So this is a critical time. The future is ours if we dare to stand up and fight.
Okay, thank you, Kent. Rich, growing up on a farm in the Yakima Valley, working in the Alaskan canneries, and as regional director of the Alaska Cannery Workers Union, how do your early experiences and background inform your approach to labor advocacy and addressing the unique challenges faced by AAPI workers in industries like agriculture and fisheries? And looking ahead, what are your hopes for the labor movement and AAPI workers' empowerment?
Thanks, Tracy. I think I'm going to not cover all of that because I only got a few minutes. If you're telling me that we got like 7 minutes, I'm just going to skip right over that. But I will say, being part of the initial APALA organization back in the late 80s and starting at our first convention, I will second exactly what Kent said. That was a time of struggle. That was a time when people were throwing everything at us, not believing that we as a group of Asian American workers can do anything. And look where we are today. With the help of many of those founding steering committee members and, continuing on this legacy of struggle, we were able to, come to Seattle, finally come to Seattle to hold a convention here. I remember the first convention, I was just dumbstruck because I had to follow Senator Daniel Inouye from Hawaii. But that wasn't bad because he had to follow one of our brothers, a UFCW organizer, Holai, who gave a tremendous speech. And he got so many people riled up. But it was just such an intense moment being there in Washington, D.C. But just to cover just a little bit of my history. I was the president of the Alaska Cannery Workers Union. And I came from a farm in central Washington, eastern Washington, a 160-acre farm, which so happened that my father was able to buy. It was on the Yakima Indian Reservation, and we toiled in the land and the soil, and then after that, I was able to go up to Alaska canneries and work up there. But the key to that, my apprenticeship, working in those industries, was the key that I was able to lock in on the elders, what we call the monongs, the old aunties and uncles who shared with me their experience. My father came here in 1926 from the Philippines. He was a child of depression, worked in the San Joaquin Valley, was able to buy a spread out in Yakima. But when I went to Alaska, that was another type of racist attitude that they had there. And because of what panelists said today, you know, Moon knew that with Carlos Bull's son, he knows about him, and with Kent, with Philip Veracruz, the struggle that they had, you know, in California with the farm workers. You know, it was all over. And in Alaska, it was really pervasive. And what we had to do there with the monongs and how they shared their stories with us was essential in terms of trying to move forward. And just that racial ideology that they had. And I will share with you just one thing, and I'm going to get off here real quick so you have some time. That I will share with you a little anecdote. How many Asian cannery workers does it take to butcher a salmon? That's a rhetorical question. Long after the Chinese and Japanese were replaced in the industry and the Filipino workers became the more dominant workforce, because congressional racial immigration policies, the industry mechanized the fish processing policies of the industry. And the fish processing invented a butcher machine. And you know what they named, the audacity they named that butcher machine? The Iron Chink. So it takes nobody, a machine does it. Yeah. And so you will see, you can Google this. And actually, you'll be visiting Wing Luke Museum here, and he has actually a plate there that comes off the machine. It says an Iron Chink. So that's where that's what we've all been talking about in terms of that history. And we got to keep that embedded in our minds, that's what they think of who we are. They can throw all that shit out there as far as derogatory statements. But we are human beings. We do have aspirations, and we do have lives. So in closing, I hope that we are able to accomplish what we do with this march today and continue that struggle. Thank you.
Well, I am really grateful for all of the thoughts that have been shared so far. And I'm going to ask you to hold all of that in your mind and maybe talk with each other more. You can walk next to one of us or more. Talk about it at the reception. Definitely go to the Wing Luke. I know that your program says that Lisa Cruz was going to also speak, but we're going to hear later from Embassy Suite. Well, that's why we're going to go down there in the shuttles. And so Eunice is going to help me explain what happens next. And I had this thought. We're doing kind of a take-back march. Now, you might be wondering, what do you mean? What are you talking about, take back? Well, when the Chinese were rounded up out of the Chinatown in Seattle, roughly the area that we were, they were marched down to the waterfront. And so we're actually following part of the route, but we're reversing it. That's what we're taking back. So this is a march about taking power and solidarity. Eunice, please.
I'm so honored to be on the stage again with Tracy, my mentor, who pushed me to be chapter leader, with Professor Moon Ho Jung, the first API leader of UW Labor Center, Ken Wong, the founding president of APALA, and Rich Gertiza, a founder of APALA. Woo! All this power, right? So Lisa is not here because she is in the hotel, in the streets, like already picketing, right, to kick off our picket line, right? What's happening there is that 4 years ago, the Embassy Suites organized their union for their first contract, first time ever, and now their contract is up for negotiations, actually expired on March 31st, right? And we're there and we're fighting for bargaining dates because we deserve to live in this city on wages that we can support our families on. We deserve respect at the job, and we deserve health and safety at the workplace, right? And so we're all going to get on shuttle buses right now. And the workforce there, as you saw Justin and Eliza here, if you saw them from Seattle chapter, they're a couple of the BIPOC leaders of the hotel, and we're going to picket there to kick it off, and then we're going to be marching up 0.3 miles to the Chinatown International District to a park where we're going to have a rally to hear from Lisa and her struggles on the shop floor, as well as our local leader from Seattle, Anita Saith, who is our president, who is the first API leader of our local. She's very, very awesome. And we're going to get in the streets and we're going to fight. So right now, I'm going to go on the first shuttle bus with all of the safety marshals. So come with me right now, and then Michaela will release people in waves not soon after.